Good afternoon, everyone. All right, so my name is Danny Redic. I'm going to be co-facilitating this conversation with my co-facilitator, uh, Kristin Hocker. So really what this is it stems out of a study group that I put together for the Levine Center in partnership with Partners in Restorative Initiatives. This group was supposed to be an extension of um, a group we did earlier in the year that was supposed to be like a talking series on ending hate, right? So examining what situations people might come across, things like identity, things like the difference and microaggressions and stuff like that, and then sort of figuring out practical ways of dealing with that. That was a very surface level talking series. It was just for people to engage in the conversation about it, and then the idea came out of to do a more intensive study group, right? So what I put together a curriculum that was primarily race and equity based in regards to the things that we've been experiencing in the country so far. So it was after the advent of the George Floyd incident and all of the backlash that happened in the country after that. So I felt it was very necessary for us to have a conversation about race in America, specifically in regards to how African Americans are viewed and a lot of the different ideas that come with that. So we dove into the systems that create it, right? We talked about white supremacy. We talked about colonialism or imperialism. We talked about patriarchy. Then we talked about how those systems interlocked and created these spots of inequity and these structures of inequity. And we ended up talking about intersectionalism and how where those systems interlocked, and then where people were being missed by different activist movements that are meant to address these inequities. We talked about current issues like defunding the police and oh goodness, like a lot of the protests that are happening. And then we are talking about how racism can be harmful, that that they're supposed to be helping, right? So what we're doing today is actually a conversation between Kristin and I, based off of that and what we sort of like think about those ideas, and sort of going through some of the same structure that we used in that study group to like structure our conversation, because Kristin is actually involved in equity education. I'll let you introduce yourself. Mm-hmm. But that's pretty much that. I don't know if you've read my bio, but I work for the Center for Youth. I do a lot of youth work there in regards to working with chronically homeless youth. But currently, I'm working in schools doing social emotional education, and I've been leading the Center for Youth's race and equity team for the past like 3-4 years. I do similar work with Peary. I do facilitation for restorative teaching. So whether it's like peace circle work, community building circles, restorative discipline, that type of stuff. And I've been involved in this type of work for a long time, whether it's restorative work or whether it's race and equity work. And it's primarily been around working with youth. All right, Kristin, I'll let you.
All right, thanks, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on a rainy Sunday. Really appreciate everyone, just engaging in these topics at this most critical time. I want to start off my comments by one of the things I appreciate doing is grounding myself in the knowledge and presence that where I live, where I do this work, is on the unceded territory of the Seneca Nation, one of the Haudenosaunee, and the significance of my presence and positionality and recognizing myself as a involuntary settler on that territory. And as Jenny mentioned, as you may have read in my own bio, I've done this work similarly in the realm of education, working at the University of Rochester, either as an organizational development specialist, where I'm having these conversations with faculty and staff about what does this mean on an organizational level. How do we go beyond just the idea of inclusivity as, kind of the false notion of participation, right? We permit people in, we count our numbers, they participate in our organization, and making movement from that paradigm into a deeper paradigm and way of being, way of functioning in an equity base, equity-minded lens, and creating equity within one's own internal structures, so that it goes beyond just people feeling included, but how do they actually feel valued? How do they feel like they have membership within that organization? How do they feel a sense of belonging? How do they feel that they have a mutual sense of investment and risk? The organization invests in them as employees, and they invest within the organization. So it's pushing beyond what we have often framed as the diversity and inclusion conversation, to getting into race, really having unapologetic conversations around race, racism, unpacking and dismantling those systems so that equity can actually function, as well as examining other isms and schisms that do exist as derivatives of the systems that Danny named and labeled, colonialism and other things that have been so deeply embedded within our history and our social structures that really do need us to take a deep investment in unraveling so that equity can happen. So that's just a bit about who I am. Danny, you want me to start off with asking you my first question, and then
Yeah, sure.
we can have our exchange from there? All right.
Yeah. So we're gonna leave some room at the end for questions. If you have any questions that you want to ask, you can throw them in the chat, and we'll get to them, after our conversation. Okay.
So my first
Go ahead,
question, yeah, my first question for you is, so the ways in which we framed our questions were in the categories of identifying systems, examining systems, and then dismantling systems. So in the realm of identifying systems, I'd be interested to hear your story and your narrative about that first moment you learned about racism as a system, and how did it feel as a Black man living in America to understand racism in that manner?
All right. So I mean, I've I've been doing race and equity work for five or so years, and I've been telling the same exact story since I started doing this work. This is a very common question, right? Like, where did you like first become aware of racism? And I was about 4 or 5 years old, right? I'm lucky enough to come from a very educated family, an educated Black family. So they, have engaged in higher education. My grandmother was a teacher. And from a very, very young age, I was being taught that because of my skin color, I couldn't act in certain ways. I couldn't speak in certain ways, and I had to work harder. Right. So from the time that I was in second grade, I got in trouble because I was prone to being bored by the curriculum that they were teaching. I learned how to read when I was like 4 years old. So being in first grade and them teaching you words that I already knew, I was the one that was acting up, right? So I got in trouble for that a lot until a social worker at the school decided to put me in a more advanced class, right? So from a very, very young age, I was being taught like that was an issue. And then as time went on, I saw more and more stuff happening that I didn't really identify as like racially motivated situations until I got to be a lot older. So I mean, being in like middle school and like trying to like join the chess club, and then and like certain students in the chess club not like wanting me to be there or not talking to me because I was the only Black kid, or being in high school and kind of like being able to skate through a lot of that type of stuff. Um, but it being sorry, my kid. Um, that coming up against situations with teachers where like I was being given by my family like literature to read and saying like, hey, read the souls of black folk, or read this history around this settler or whatever, and getting into arguments in like eighth and ninth grade with history teachers about Columbus not discovering America, and or like uh the whole like idea about like um why Sherman would come into Atlanta and burn the city down, and like and having conversations around what I understood from being like sort of hyper educated and hyper vigilant about this stuff, with people that were sort of attached to the sort of rote narrative of white colonial history. And then as I got older, I started, getting into contact with police um, and sort of experiencing that side of it, that side of the like my racialization. So, I mean, quite honestly, just to be succinct about answering the question, it's been a lifelong process. But the first moment was when I was 5 years old, and my mom told me never to run from the police, work harder in school because of your skin color, and not to behave in a certain way. And that's sort of been the like continual conversation that's been happening, even a conversation I've had to have with my own daughter, who just showed herself. um so I want to ask you a question, Kristen. So I mean, similarly, like as a woman of color, when were you first confronted with the reality of race in America? And I think for women in America, and especially women of color, there's an idea about intersectionality that shapes your experience differently. So, can you talk about how the realization of that intersectionality shaped your experience, and when you started coming to that realization about race in America? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah. The protest tune of 2020. You have to unmute yourself. So I share, as I was listening to your story, I could relate exactly. Like I can almost mark my own arguments with teachers. I can mark my own recognition of just being treated in a way that was disparate. Like I had I would act up in class, and I think I pulled a child's hair when I was in second grade, and it's one of those things where you spend like a whole eternity processing, but I could never understand why a second grade teacher felt the need to come and pull my hair as a response to teach me the lesson to not pull other people's hair. But she did. And I almost became a second grade dropout of school because of that, because I just went over to my desk and I started packing up my bag. Now, had I had the language, if there was a cartoon bubble over my head, it would have been like, oh, no, she just did it. Who the hell does she think she is? Kind of conversation. But even then, it was like that incident to me never marked as racism because we didn't have those conversations. Like my mom was already dealing with going through divorce and going through a really painful divorce, and she was a survivor of domestic violence, and I think she was just also navigating the world from from a space that I didn't realize until I read Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, was in that framework of uplift suasion. And this was something that had been passed down from her great grandmother to her grandmother. And it was about this, if we look right, if we act right, if we speak right, right, that's how we move through society. Then I don't know, for some reason it was supposed to be like Teflon, right? Like the racism was just supposed to bounce off of us for some reason. But then I'm coming home, I think I was like 8 years old. walking home in dead of winter, and this is, in Long Island. And this boy who I knew was just extraordinarily violent. He was like the bully of the neighborhood, and like everybody just avoided him. And somehow felt the need to take his anger out on me, pushed me down in the snow, and just pelt me with like ice and just kept calling me the N-word over and over again. And all I can remember was just like getting home and not only just like feeling sadness, but feeling like frightened. And I just, didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave my house. I remember we had these neighbors across the street. They had this like airline trailer, and they would just cuss up a storm. And they had a little girl that would come over in play in my yard. And I didn't want her to come over to play, not because I didn't like the little girl, but I didn't feel comfortable with the fact that her dad used to stand there in his like undershirt and jeans and just watch us with his arms crossed, you know, and why he felt okay to just come in my yard like that and do that. And you don't have language for this when you're a child, you know. I didn't have parents that were sitting me down and going, hey baby, that's racism, hey baby, that's what racism is. And it wasn't really until I started graduate school, and when you start looking at the analysis and reading stuff like critical race theory, it wasn't until I started to teach institutionalized racism, and I'm reading, Stokely Carmichael, aka Kwame Ture, and Charles Hamilton's Black Power. And meanwhile, I got this mom that's just like, don't follow the radical blacks, don't follow radical black voices. Like, I didn't have that exposure. And then I'm reading this and I'm like, I should have been reading this as a kid because it would have helped me really understand. And then, I'm teaching institutionalized racism. I start teaching about redlining. And then I look at this map of Long Island and I look at where I grew up in North Belmore. And it's, I don't know how many miles it is, but I'm going to guess it's a good 50 miles from Levittown, Rhode Island, Long Island. And I'm like, ah. And so you start to trace back from like the more that you start to unpack this stuff from that historical perspective, from the systemic perspective, then you also trace back in our own lineage where the ideology has impacted us in those Advent moments in time, and go, oh, that's what that was.
Yeah,
that's what that was.
And that's and this like brings it back to what we did in the study group. Like the first session, we explored identity, right? And it's very purposeful when I put that exercise in there for us to identify for ourselves what identities we see ourselves as and what we think other people see us as, but more importantly to like see what is advantaged by white supremacist culture, by patriarchal culture, because that's sort of like we already know where we're disenfranchised, we already know where we're oppressed, right? And that gives us the empathy to engage in this sort of stuff. Like when we get later on in life and it's like, okay, well, it took a long time for me to get to addressing my own patriarchy. I mean, I did it in college as a means of a liberal arts educated male in that sort of sphere or whatever, where like college is meant to teach you the sort of radicalism, whatever. I was reading the text, I was engaged in that stuff, and I, in a very like surface level, looked at the patriarchy that I was expressing in my life, but I was very focused on the racial experience that I had, and that, and like just the first anecdote that you told, the story that you told about the young man pushing you down, like that's where that intersectionality lies, where that's patriarchal violence, right? That is fueled by racial hatred.
Sure, the two definitely go hand in hand. I mean, it's like they create a mini instruction manual, so not only are you allowed to commit violence among these people because they're black, but you can also commit violence on this particular person because she's a girl, and because she won't fight back, right? And whatever it is that's warping, and unbeknownst, I mean, of course, I turned 30 years later to that incident, and understand like what is going on in that young man's life. What, like, if that's the messaging, how is he able to feel free in his own world? I mean, of course, there's some aspect of wanting to have some compassion, just from my own Buddhist nature, but you know, but I think to respond to the second question of that, about which part of that do I feel, of those experiences, do I feel that intersectionality, from where I've also been impacted as a woman, as a Black woman. And I think, yeah, what you named is just the susceptibility to violence, and the permission to commit violence against my person, against my body. So that's where those two interlock for me, is that permission from someone else to feel free to commit violence. And that commitment of violence can even be just, deterring me from having work. The times when I've had to pursue work as someone who had a child and was asked, well, where are you going to find childcare? Are you going to be late all the time? So that assumption came up.
Right.
And so recognizing that, I have a multiple faces in which I walk through the world, right? Not only do I walk through the world in this body, in this presence of a gendered identity, but then on top of that is that racialized identity that becomes an intermeshing of how people's thoughts, processes see me, perceive of me. So eventually, what it came down to is I just turned into like this, what I call the weird Black girl, because that all those things had so many different layers, and it became like, what's going to be my armor? How am I going to distinguish myself, and also reclaim myself, how I really understand in myself.
And that, that it actually in itself is something that I ended up having to do as well, right? Like because of like the way my educational like trajectory went, like the programs that I was being put into and stuff like that, because of like, if I was having like a behavioral issue in the class or whatever, they like did some testing or whatever. They're like, okay, well, this kid is smart. Let's put him in a smart class. Maybe the challenge will help him, I ended up being around more people, like less and less people to look like me, right? I was in environments where I was around more and more white students. I was around more and more white teachers, and my whole demeanor had to change around that. I mean, I already came from a family that didn't let me speak slang in the house, that exposed me to a lot of different stuff or whatever. I mean, it was like exposed to, like classical music and jazz and, like a very like rich cultural experience. But for a long time, I had to position myself as a person outside of who I thought I was supposed to be. Right. And I was a Black kid that grew up in New York City, and all of the things that were associated with who I was as that kid, I had to, for my family's sake, sort of push away from that so I can assimilate more readily. And then, in those environments where I was expected to be a certain way, I had to speak in a certain way, I had to be something other than what it was that I felt like I needed to be, because of the like that sort of intersectionality of like of identity and the possibility of even like emotional violence being played out in my body, and not nearly in the same way as it would be double fold for you with like the Black female body and then the female body itself. But but I feel that, that like being the weird kid.
There's like this push and pull of assimilation.
Yeah.
So, I hear what you're saying about that. And then I think I had the added layer of, having lighter skin, and just the constant questions of who are you? Where, are you mixed?
Yeah.
And depending on which point you caught me, back in my younger self, who just, I just wanted to belong. I just wanted to feel a sense of membership. I just wanted to be. And so, I would, make up all sorts of stuff, about, just to respond. And because I didn't have that critical lens, right? And then there's a critical lens sharpened. Sometimes my response would be, oh, I'm historically mixed. Just to see people raise their eyebrow and then, give that as a open to some explanation. But, I think what it did was for some reason, I think, one thing you have to do is, for me, I think, to preserve my own sanity, is as I look at the timeline of recognizing, the dynamics of assimilation, the things that, and I, moved around different places. So I lived in Louisiana, I lived in St. Louis, I lived in, Brooklyn, and each of those spaces and places meant a different sense of adaptation, right? Because, I went from complete all white environments to complete all Black school in Brooklyn. And I got to tell you, like, either way, I didn't really understand how to navigate both spaces. Coming from Long Island, it was, at least somewhat integrated in the realms of race. But, there I go from this starkness of homogeneity. And it was still a push and pull of assimilation upon who I was and how I can navigate myself. Because even in the all Black environment, it was, you speak white, you're this, you're that, you're not Black enough, you don't listen to this music, you go do weird things with your mom, like, like, so, it's just always a critique and a question about who I was, as opposed to, and I love the fact that I think what I appreciate about this newer generation is that has changed, that has shifted so much. So I see such an embracing, the whole mantra of all Black lives matter is a mantra of recognizing, like, we're not going to be in that colonized framework anymore, where we're, battling about our different color differentiations in that sense, right? Because that's not going to help us feel liberation.
So that's another thing that I want to, like, kind of switch gears a little bit so we can get to the other questions.
Sure.
That's another thing that I do see happening, right? Like a younger generation. I see a lot of videos of young men, especially young Black men, being stopped by the police for whatever reason.
Sure.
And their response isn't, like the thing that I see more often, as far as like what I'm seeing in the media or whatever, is older Black men being shot and attacked, right? Younger Black men have a very, like, and this is not for everyone's case or whatever, but a lot of the videos that I see is like, is where the coverage is coming from, is the younger Black men that are more angry, they're more ready to question the authority of the police officer. They know their rights, they know their ability to engage, and they know whether or not they did something wrong, right? So their response is a very decolonized response, and as opposed to what mine would be as, like, a 36-year-old man, where I have seen what violence against Black men looks like, and I don't have that sense of invincibility that an 18-year-old has. And they have, like, a sense of, like, you don't have a right to treat me this way, and you have no authority over me. You're my servant, as far as, like, the police are concerned. So, I mean, it's very interesting to watch this happen, because it's not nearly the same as, like, I have family members that are alive now that participated in the civil rights movement, and their participation was completely different than mine would have been when I was protesting about certain stuff, and I was going to Black Lives Matter marches, where I'm yelling at police and stuff like that. But if I get stopped by the police in my private life, I'm going to be a little bit more compliant.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, if anything, so to segue into the next compartment of questions about examining systems, and I think this will be a continuation of where you're started, and this idea of this generational shift and I don't even really believe in like generational shifts, but I just think like the shifting of the shifting of time, the shifting of
Mm,
understanding, right? So I was curious as what is a conversation around examining such systems, right? The systems that we name, white supremacy, patriarchy, right? What does that conversation around examining systems and structures look like when you're working with youth, and specifically the youth that you encounter at the Center of Youth? How does one break all this down for young ones to understand and figure out their own forms of advocacy and activism? And or how do the youth teach us? Because I'm
mm,
recognizing that there are a lot of youth out there that are far smarter than I am.
mm.
And how do I follow them? How do I learn to get out the way so that
So,
they are, leading the charge?
right. Well, one of the things that I've seen, and I've engaged a lot of different youth in like these conversations, whether it's like doing a very large group of young people to teach them how to tell their stories to legislators, so they're
Mm-hmm.
not being taken advantage of, right? So they're not
Mm-hmm.
re-traumatizing themselves, so they're not being exploited, right? They own their experience and they're making sure that they're getting paid for it, even if it's in the act of trying to secure more funding for programs,
Right,
right?
right.
um, so the Center for Youth and other youth agencies around the state have a tradition of bringing young people to Albany and parading them in front of legislators and saying, tell your sad story so this legislator will drop a single tear and throw us money,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I've seen that. I've seen the demonstration of the sad
Right,
eyes,
right. You
and
know,
it's annoying as heck.
and one of the things that I found super interesting is that when I ran the street outreach team for Center for Youth, so I had a lot of young interns that were under the age of like 23, anywhere from like 16 to 23, and I hired a bunch of them, and then I had a bunch of clients that I worked with in the same capacity, and the young people that would go to the legislators, like one of the things that they would come back and like, there's one story that these two young men that I work with would always tell, and they would make fun of this kid where like he said this white lady is like, like, hey, so and so, tell your story, and there's a bunch of legislators in suits, and this kid comes up and he takes his hat off and puts it on his chest and tells this like soliloquy of a sad story about his experience as a homeless young person, and they find it hilarious, right? Like the young men that I work with, they're like, what is wrong with you, kid? Like, you're like, and their idea about it is, and this is something that they understood themselves, right? Is that is a Jim Crow way of addressing white people, and you need to have a little bit more dignity about yourself,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
So that was one of the things that I honed in on, and I was like, oh, junk, like, so there are young women that I'm working with that are going to these legislators and they're advocating for funding for the safe harbor program, right, for
Mm-hmm,
commercial sex trafficking,
mm-hmm.
and they have to tell these horrific stories about their rapes and the dealings with their pimps and being homeless and having to like sleep with people for money or a place to stay and stuff like that, and they are doing that sort of hat off, handle to the chest soliloquy type of thing where they've lost their sense of dignity because they're begging for something,
Yeah,
what I'm saying, like in order to
yeah,
do
yeah,
something good, you know
yeah.
um so a lot of my work there had to do with informing them of that and using the experience of the young people that had already gained a sense of self, where they would not stoop lower, they wouldn't put themselves in a lower position, a lower social position, a lower cultural position, in
Sure.
order to placate the ego of like that
A
white
legislator.
supremacist. Yeah,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
Well, I think it's it goes right back to this idea of the assimilationist ideology and
Mhm.
structure that I think infects us all to some
Mhm.
extent, right? Because the framework of white supremacy has been around a white standardization of a modus operandi, right? And I think you see that as well when you hear people say, "Oh, I wouldn't mind the protesters if they would protest peacefully."
Right.
If only they would stop, burning things. If only they would stop looting things. If only they would, right? And it's like it becomes this. This is the acceptable parameter in which I will hear your demands,
Mm-hmm.
as if it's a thought exercise,
Mm-hmm.
instead of people speaking truth, right, and reacting to this thing that is deterring their full participation as citizens, as
Right.
well as eradicating their notion of humanity.
And
And I really appreciate
oh,
I can't remember her name, but she was the woman that had she was in the street. They were shooting Kimberly Johnson. Kimberly, I think it's
mm,
Johnson, where she just like basically somebody had asked her about that reaction of this idea of like, I can't deal with the protesters because they're looting, and she speaks to the guy from the Daily Show, Noah,
um,
Trevor
Trevor Noah.
Noah's speech about the contract, right? The breach of the contract. We have this social contract that only one group is actually benefiting from, and the other group
Mm-hmm.
is somehow deemed to participate, but without any of their interests being recognized, and how that social contract is being disregarded. And and she breaks it down to like the fact that one of the things we don't even learn in history is the moment in time, that brief time of reconstruction, in which Black people were thriving, right? That time in before the 1920s, when Black towns actually had wealth.
Right. The black congressman.
When Black congressmen were
Yeah.
making laws and registration. And I think it's Carol Anderson just has this book
Okay.
called
Yeah.
White Rage, and speaks of the backlash of that, and how and that's so people are now seeing a backlash of we're not doing this anymore, and they're surprised, like, why are people
Mm-hmm.
so angry?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you were supposed to take another at least another century of oppression. Like, I don't
Mm-hmm.
understand why you would burn down a CVS in order to protest that. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
instead of examining what has been done so far, you know what even the notions of progress, such as Brown versus the Board of Education, and really unpacking, are we still seeing equity as a practice within our education systems, when our own Rochester City School District system is so resource deprived that it's barely alive, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, in some, just having that wish that people would be more upset, just as upset about racism as they are about having a conversation about racism.
Well, and you know what? Like, it brings to mind King's, letter from the Birmingham jail, right?
Yeah,
He
yeah,
said the same exact thing in
yeah.
the same exact circumstance, right? And the
Mhm,
people that
mhm.
he was calling out primarily were liberals that were saying not now, right?
Clergy,
So, right,
nonetheless.
clergy, right, that
Mhm,
sent him to jail.
mhm, mhm.
And protested his release, and but the idea, and that's the thing that I really wanted to like get at and examine, was like, where does anti-racism falter, right? And I really think it falters with the liberal. I think it falters with the liberal. It's not the conservative person that is like vehemently against this sort of like destruction of property and this sort of you know uh, breach of the social contract. I think it's the liberal that participates in very insidious and like very subtle ways in that same idea, right?
Mhm.
um the whole idea of like, well, why would you burn down your own city? Because it's not their city,
Right,
you know
right. Well,
um
and I wonder, and something I've been showing recently in workshops is Marlon James's question that he poses: Are you non-racist? Are you anti-racist?
yeah.
And this is something that even Ibram Kendi
Hmm.
poses, right? So there's a big difference between, saying, well, I'm not racist, but then not doing a damn thing towards
Hmm.
shifting the tides of racism, as opposed to being anti-racist and being actively critical,
Hmm.
being, the one that, examines what the policy structures are, being the one that, actually writes the letters and responds and makes the phone calls, being the one that listens to Black, Indigenous, people of color, advocates, and listens to what the demands are and start to adapt that language and that paradigm, does that self-education of why are these demands important, what is really behind the call for defunding the police, as opposed to just questioning, right? And
Yeah.
ceases to see this as just some thought exercise that they can just examine through their head, but
Hmm.
gets into that heart-head connection because they
So
realize that this is about impacting lives.
so just really quickly,
Mm-hmm.
and because you like, and this is something that actually happened in a study group. Like every time we'd get into these conversations and we start like
Getting into rhythm.
examining, right? Yeah, but like
Mm.
you specifically were touching on stuff that we'd be talking about the next session. Just like, and I'm
All
like,
right.
we're gonna get there, but I don't want to leave the rest
I
of the group
can't help it
behind.
when my third eye starts tingling,
It's working.
you know?
Um, but so one of the things I wanted to ask you is,
Mm,
I mean, in regards to dismantling systems, right?
mhm,
That tier
mhm,
of conversation, like
mhm,
where do you see, and I want you to speak specifically about your work with the medical field and education. Where do
mhm.
you see these like movements of anti-racism, anti-sexism, these sort of, that the distinction between being not racist and actively anti-racist? Where do you see this stuff like causing harm to people of color, and whether that's the people that your students are going to be going to serve or your students themselves? Like where do you see that, do you see that happening? Like do you
Yeah,
see these structures causing harm or these initiatives causing harm, and what do you suppose is like a way to engage in correct anti-racist movement?
sure, sure. So I think for me, again, I think I would make that distinction that if it's causing harm, it's definitely not anti-racist.
Mm.
I would say that it's still maintaining that preservation of being non-racist. And I think that the distinct difference is when the motivation towards whatever action is happening, if it's in a non-racist positionality, then it's in that preservation for seeming to look good, right? Well, we need to create a response letter because we need to seem to look good. We need to seem like we look like we care. And I
Mm.
used to have a colleague who would use the phrase, they do things in the appearance of, right? That category of when actions are what do I want to say? Um, when they want to look good, right?
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
opposed to actually doing good. Actually wanting to do good is when you're just, and I've often said that from where I am, a lot of that work that of people who are definitely rooted in anti-racism work very much happens on an underground railroad space,
Hmm.
because very often these are people that either recognize where their sphere of influence is and are pushing so past the dynamics of power, and pushing at levels in which they are risking their own, jobs, their own status,
Hmm.
um, because they are so grounded in that where their moral compass is, where that stance is,
Hmm.
again, on the impact of people's lives and humanity.
Right.
So there's currently a crop of people who are doing abolitionist work, people who are doing prison justice, decarceration work.
Hmm.
Those are things that I see that are in that anti-racism realm, right? That
Right.
decolonization realm.
Mm.
Um, I think, and just because of the time that we have left, there's a really good book that I presented to one of the classes that I taught. It's called "A Third University is Possible," and it's by author who just goes by La Paperson. And they wrote this text in the realm of how universities, how people in universities can disrupt the systems of universities, the mechanics of universities, thinking from a third world cinema perspective of how do we get and decenter the narratives and decenter the systems and structures and push them in a way that is towards decolonizing those systems and structures, while recognizing we're still doing it on stolen territory, on spaces and places that sold and swapped slaves in order to be able to, finance themselves, right? So, it's almost an accountant measure of Audre Lorde's, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. But, it's saying, okay, then we're going to go in the master's house without using the master's tools. We're going to find other tools to dismantle this house.
And I mean, just really briefly, I mean, like, I do think that how to, and like speaking to like the title of this conversation, like how to be an anti-racist is like, are you focused on optics? Are you focused on how it looks? Or do you not care what the mechanism looks like that you use to put this into motion, right? Because a lot of, I think, white supremacists and colonialists and capitalist and patriarchal culture is focused on is how does it look, right? How are we coming across rather than who we are. And
if you look at any Victorian movie, it'll show you exactly what that looks like.
Right. And if who you are as a person that is concerned with how it looks, then you're not doing the right thing. Right. And it's going to be ugly, right? Because we're really taking down people's like sense of self in the act of anti-racism, and like a sense of self that's associated with institutions, which is worse. If you're locked into the way, like, your identity is associated specifically with an institution, whether it's a university or an agency or an organization, and you have to confront the idea that you've been participating in this agency's widespread racism, right? That's going to be an ugly thing to dismantle, right? And the optics of it is a problem, because you can do any manner of, okay, well, we put this thing in place and we did these trainings and it feels good on the surface, but it doesn't really do anything, because it's not really confronting the issue in a way that is that Underground Railroad sort of way.
Right. Unless the next step is, we did these trainings and here are the processes that we identified that we need to tackle. Here are the measures that we're putting in place to ensure that those systems change. Here are the key team members that are taking responsibility for that. Right. I'm always about learning. I think, because for me, I wouldn't and I think we're both an attestment to that. I wouldn't know any of this to myself, to be able to explain it to myself and unpack myself in my own experience, had I not read. But that can't be it, right? That can't be it. You have to also translate that into action. And part of the reason why I was doing such deeply embedded reason is because my action was, I have to be ready to teach this. I had to know what it is that I want to teach. How do I want, I have to create these objectives. And I had to think about, what is this all going to inspire from this future generation who are going to be in these careers in which they can make a difference, right?
Okay. So we're getting the signal to wrap it up.
Okay.
And I really appreciate talking to you about this.
Likewise. I never thought I would enjoy spending a Sunday talking about racism, but here we are.
I don't know if we have time to take questions if people want to stay for a little bit longer. But I'm open to answering questions if anyone would like to ask anything.
Yeah. And I also hope that these are questions that, what Danny and I have asked each other are questions that you as participants can think about, even just, finding your own accountability partner and, sitting down and having these same type of conversations and disseminating these same ideas and thoughts from your own perspective and positionality. Because I think that's what continuously, I know that I always feel more inspired to say, okay, let me get back into the, get back into it, get back into doing the work.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no questions from the group.
Well, thank you, Charlie. So I just hear a comment from Charlie that this has been a thought and feeling provoking session. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Yes, thank you again, and hopefully you'll hear more about another study session. I'm very excited to put another one together, so just keep your eyes and ears open for that.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.